My name is Gabriel Sanchez. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of New Mexico. I'm also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and run UNM Center for Social Policy. And this is a very difficult thing for voters to track. Ordinarily, even in a quote-unquote regular presidential campaign, there's an overabundance of information, and these days disinformation, that comes at voters at rapid fire. You just accelerate that by about tenfold in this campaign season, where I think over the last 3 weeks, we've had everything from a major debate that led to widespread speculation that President Biden should step down out of the race, to an assassination attempt to former President Trump, and a movement right on the Democratic side moving away from Biden at the top of the ticket to Vice President Harris. All of that has happened so quickly. I think one of the things that it's important to recognize is for a lot of individual voters, that might mean something that ordinarily would have a huge impact on their voting preferences, like an assassination attempt, might fall off as being important. But many voters might not necessarily forget about that, but it loses its impact as so many other major events seem to take place almost daily during the campaign season. So that's one thing just to point out, is it makes things more difficult and challenging for voters to be informed, but also potentially diminishes the impact of any singular event on really overall presidential outcomes and the way that voters decide who they're going to vote for in the race. Now, typically, vice presidential picks don't have as much of an impact as we often think that they do. In fact, typically, in an election that's not razor thin, they don't really have a measurable impact on the overall outcome. Candidates at the presidential level tend to look for any gaps in their own individual resumes, where they might sell well to voters in regions of the country, particular subgroups of the electorate, and essentially try to pick vice presidents that address some of those gaps. And I think that's what you've seen on both sides of the aisle right now. I think, unfortunately, an over-inundation with negative campaigning. And that's nothing new. I think every time I talk about this in the context of New Mexico, I often say two things. One, we'll probably have a record-breaking amount of money spent on campaign ads. No reason to think that's not going to happen again now in 2024. And because of how much money goes into it, a lot by outside PACs, campaigning tends to get much more negative each election cycle. And we're already, unfortunately, seeing evidence of that, not only on the presidential side, but some of the congressional races that we're seeing here in New Mexico and across the country. So I think voters should, unfortunately, anticipate more of that, and that's more of the same for a lot of those folks in terms of how they're seeing the election shaping up and the amount of money spent on campaigning. The other thing that I think we should pay attention to is, as we get closer to the overall election date, right, how much more craziness is going to happen in this election cycle, violence, these type of things that we don't like to see, that could impact not just the way in which voters cast their ballot, but how many people choose to decide to vote and participate in democracy. Many of us experts are extremely worried about turnout, enthusiasm, whether or not all these things are dangers to democracy in an environment, unfortunately, where many voters might perceive their individual vote does not matter as much as they wish that it would. Absolutely, important question. I think we're seeing election after election a greater percentage of voters who don't feel that they have election integrity in this country. They don't trust necessarily that their vote will count, that there's not going to be some interference, whether that's from another government or here in the United States, that essentially tries to steal the election. Obviously, former President Trump has made that part of his campaign effort, and we've seen a lot of other Republicans essentially back that play up and emphasize really this underlying concern about voter integrity. So we see a greater percentage of Americans who are worried about that, and I think all of us that are experts and have an opportunity to get in front of the public and talk about these matters just have to remind all of our American voting public there was no evidence of voter fraud in the last presidential election, even though former President Trump's own administration did research on this. They didn't even find any evidence of voter fraud. So we just have to remind folks of the facts, right? Our voting systems in the United States have always worked. It might be a slow and sometimes, right, clunky process, but we always get it right at the end. And I think the more we emphasize that to voters, hopefully it increases their confidence in the overall outcome. And obviously seeing a clean overall presidential election where we don't have a lot of debate about whether or not things were stolen. We have a smooth transition in power. All things that did not happen in our last presidential election cycle will go a long way, particularly for young voters, that this might be their first election that they've ever voted in, solidifying democracy works in this country. I should be a lifelong voter. Yeah, Vice President Harris has an incredibly difficult job, right? She's essentially trying to take what would ordinarily be probably a 2-year overall presidential campaign season and condense that into a matter of months. So I think, fortunately for her, she might be the only candidate on the Democratic side that could step into this and run at the pace that she's going to be expected to run at. And that's primarily because she already has experience campaigning in a presidential cycle, knows what comes with that, has experience getting in front of reporters, getting in front of large audiences, and having to defend herself in campaign. And she's also privy to information none of the other candidates, including former President Trump, have access to. So I think those things, sitting as vice president, really are going to help her moving into a very difficult challenge of essentially trying to catch up in a race where she feels like she just started. Yeah, I think probably the number one issue that's going to drive, at least what we're seeing in polls and focus groups, how voters actually think about how they'll cast their ballot, is the economy. On both sides, Democrats and Republicans, you ask them what's the most important issue. For the most part, inflation, cost of living is number one, then more high-paying jobs is number two, and then, number three could be a mix of costs of healthcare or costs of other goods. So clearly the economy is going to drive, in my opinion, who's going to actually win the presidency. But that means different things to different people, right? I think for most folks, when you ask them in more depth, what do you mean by inflation and cost of living and why you think the economy is the most important issue, they don't talk about things like the stock market, the overall performance of the national economy, things that a lot of reporters like to talk about when they're covering the economy. They're really talking about their own everyday expenses and how their family is going to meet really their overall individual finances, being able to afford just basics in their household. And so I think the challenge is for both candidates to be able to connect with voters at that level, right? Not talk about abstract concepts like GDP or consumer confidence, but be able to connect with individual Americans at their level. How am I as president going to make the cost of food, the cost of gas, of transportation, all these things that Americans think about daily more affordable so that their individual paychecks go a little bit further? I think the candidate that can do that effectively and communicate at that level is probably going to be our next president. I would expect a lot of consistency, primarily because obviously Vice President Harris was part of the Biden administration. So in many regards, she's going to have to run with the same general themes that President Biden was running with because she's part of that ticket, right? But I think she has a unique opportunity to be able to put some distance between herself and President Biden on some unpopular policy actions or some unpopular campaign messages that President Biden was running with. And I think that's the interesting dynamic of how far she goes in those directions to essentially make herself as attractive to the Democratic base, but pick up some moderate voters that Biden was having challenges with. A couple of examples on that. I think young voters had some pretty serious concerns with President Biden's climate change agenda, felt that maybe he leaned a little bit too far to oil and gas lobbyists on some national issues, particularly some pipeline decisions that he made in Alaska. I think Vice President Harris has a unique opportunity to say, hey, you know what? I don't necessarily agree with the president on all these issues. I think differently. And if she leans in on some of that to young voters, picks up some enthusiasm, wins back some of those young voters that polling was suggesting Biden was having some difficult times with, that obviously will bode very well for her. Well, I think one of the things that I often am reminded of every election cycle is we often criticize young voters because typically voters under the age of 30 will have the lowest turnout rates of any age group, without recognizing we have to give these young people credit for paying close attention to the news, trying to read up as much as they can in policy, in a very difficult environment where candidates typically aren't talking about the issues that young people care about. So I think what I always stress to young people, whether it's in the classroom or in opportunities like this to get in front of a camera, is to make sure that you utilize your right to vote as a collective voting bloc. Right? Young voters are one of the most powerful potential voting blocs in this country. So as a subgroup, if they show the power and strength of their population to vote in higher numbers than is anticipated, I guarantee you candidates next election cycle are going to listen, pay attention, and try to be responsive to the issues that young people care about.